So in my book, Sweet and Sour, I was fortunate to enlist at least 10 different people who had ties to Chinese family restaurants to write about their experiences independently of each other, because I wanted to see what common experiences they had. And I take this theme from the documentarian, Canadian-Chinese documentarian, Chok Kwan. He went to 15 different countries all around the world, including like Israel, Cuba, Norway, just to name a few, and he went and found people who ran Chinese restaurants. And so he says not only is he going to get a good meal, or expects to get a good meal, but he'll also discover a personal story, a unique story of courage, survival, and hope. And I think that really kind of hits the nail around the head, because in the stories that I was able to collect, and some that I wasn't able to include, I think that's a common theme, and that's sort of partly what motivates me to engage in these writings. And here are just a couple of images that that I'm sure would be familiar to some of you. Family-run businesses, and here's one in nearby Lodi, the new Shanghai restaurant. And as a special treat for you, I actually have someone who has a connection to the new Lodi restaurant, and I'm going to invite Julie Wong Hornsby, who kindly agreed to come today and share some of her memories about experiences in that life. So please welcome Julie. Oh, yes, here.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I wanted to thank John and also to my cousin Mel Brown. It's my understanding when John was explaining this project to Mel, who was a writer himself, he replied that he indeed had married into a family that had a Chinese restaurant, and the Mel offered his services to gather information as he was coming to California for a visit. And thus the story begins. My grandfather started this restaurant, and in a typical fashion, the family lived over the restaurant for many years. It wasn't until my parents took over the business that the restaurant moved across the street to a new, bigger location, and we got to move into a real house. Interestingly, the story comes near the end of our chapter. John writes that my parents operated the popular eatery for another 25 years. Well, those were my years. The foundation of the restaurant had already been set, and my parents just continued it. The restaurant was part of our lives, and we didn't really think anything more than that. I took a series of photographs right before my parents sold the business, and I'm not sure why I did that, but I did. And when Noah was looking at them, he said, "Boy, these are really interesting pictures." I took pictures of the new Shanghai, and the picture you see here is actually in front of the old Shanghai. You don't see the neon sign, which had the predominant chop suey on it, but I do have a picture of the new Shanghai restaurant signage, which somehow lost the chop suey part of it at that point. But in the pictures that I took, I also took pictures of like a noodle machine that we had that was the size of a shopping cart. I always found that fascinating, because we made our own noodles. The row of the big woks, crocks of the salted eggs that we had in our basement. My cousin Mel had asked why I took these pictures before I did, or why I took the pictures that I did. And I think I was just trying to save the images from my past, that I know once the restaurant changed hands, it was going to change. It's no longer, it's no longer ours. But this is where I grew up. When the restaurant moved across the street, it was much bigger. There was a banquet room. It was the largest Chinese restaurant in Lodi. Miss Lodi herself came and cut the ribbon at the grand opening. There was a picture of it in the paper. But like I said, we made our own noodles with the pasta machine. We had chashao and barbecued spare ribs that we cooked in our own roaster. We even had our own setup in the back where we grew our own bean sprouts. You know, because a lot of the things weren't available, so we made them ourselves. When there was a lull in business, my dad put in a steam table for the buffet lunch. That was a favor for the after the church crowds on Sundays. And it certainly was a case of it takes a village. And my Uncle Jack would come over on the weekends, and if there was a big banquet going on, you know, perhaps some of the other relatives would be recruited. And for quite a number of years, both my grandmothers were in Lodi, and they would oversee all the grandchildren. If the kids were younger, they could play in the big basement that we had downstairs. There was plenty of room to ride tricycles around. But it was still being very typical, and everyone got to help out. My Uncle Jack would come on the weekends, all the kids would be put to work. In my family, we had 4 older girls and 1 boy. And my cousins, there were 2 older girls and 1 boy. There seems to be a pattern. And with all these kids, we would all take orders into the kitchen, bust the tables, pack the takeout orders, whatever that needed to be done. Years before, there were little individual packages of the soy sauce. We would package our own. We all sat around the table as someone would dispense the soy sauce in the little plastic cups, and us kids would put the little plastic lids on, and we did that for the hot mustard, and we would put fortune cookies and tea bags and little white bags to go with the takeout orders. And thanks to all that training, I'm quite the good carrot peeler and shrimp sheller and an excellent fly swatter. While reading John's book, there was also a common thread in us teenage restaurant workers. Most of us didn't have much of a social life, as confirmed by my cousin buying the book. We didn't join many clubs or go to football games, as we were in the restaurant helping out while we were doing our homework. One thing that I do remember is that when one works in a Chinese restaurant, one's clothes tends to smell like chow mein. I had clothes that I only wore on the weekends, as they went straight into the hamper as not to contaminate the rest of my clothes. And I think the restaurant was part of our lives more than we originally thought. Preparing for today, I was thinking about my grandmother's final ride from the funeral home to the cemetery. As it was customary, the procession made a couple of pointed stops. One being my parents' home as she lived with us, and then also stopping at the restaurant as well. But the New Shanghai was also a gathering place. If you can imagine, we had Thanksgivings there. Thanksgiving being one of the few days that we were actually closed. My parents would invite quite a number of families. We had all the tables and plates that one would need, and the buffet steam table was ready to go. My dad would make a huge roast turkey, and there would be mashed potatoes, green beans, sweet potatoes, and bouffant. People would bring food, and somebody always brought onion rings, which I could never figure out. But then the visiting families and friends, they would also come to the restaurant because, you know, that's where my parents were. They would have something to eat and maybe to emotionally touch base. One of my cousins who was at John's lecture on Sunday, after seeing one of our pictures in the book, had exclaimed, "I remember that table." There was a large round table that the family and staff would have our evening meals. And she said we would sit there and visit all the time. When my parents decided to sell the business, I just remember them telling us right before the sale. I never asked them, but they didn't ask any of us if we were interested in the restaurant. At that time, a couple of us were married, some were off to college. I'm not even sure if any of us would have wanted to take over the restaurant. Maybe it was just not a big thing to them. Just something that somehow managed to provide for the family all these years, and hoping, as most parents do, that the children would go on to something better. And I wanted to finish with a story about the restaurant. It was during the fishing season, and a couple of Caucasian men, Ofan, came to the restaurant's back door and struck a deal with my mother in exchange for a big pot of salmon carcasses, because they had already filleted, you know, they took the prime fillets off already. They got a big order of Chinese food. I'm sure both parties were snickering, thinking that they got the better of the deal. You know where I'm going. The man, the Chinese food for stuff that they were going to throw away, and then my mom does everyday food for what was going to be a feast of steamed salmon heads and tails with a black bean sauce. And again, I want to thank John for preserving our collective cultural history, and also to my cousin Nell for helping preserve my personal history.
Thank you so much for that moving personal experience sharing, and I'm sure probably if we had another couple of hours, we'd get the other 11 or 12 people here to give some equally poignant stories. But this is partly why I like doing this so much. I learn all these stories. When I first started out, I was writing my own story, and people said, "Oh, that's really interesting." But over the course of the years, I've learned about at least 20 or 30 other stories that are much better or more exciting than my own. So I feel